Guys, so today we're going to be talking about Brazil's economic state. This is by me, Ashanti, Liam, and Mary. So I'm going to be talking about some of Brazil's prominent figures, one of them being President or former President Getulio Vargas. Getulio Vargas was president in the 30s. His government was also known as a dictatorship. Um, his dictatorship was known amongst his supporters as the New State, and his government tried to suppress his rivals. And despite suppression of his rivals, he was able to diversify the agricultural sector. He was also able to enact social legislation that ultimately was able to help the working class people. He also implemented the policy of ISI, or import substitution industrialization. Using this policy, he hoped to accelerate industrialization in Brazil. In addition, GDP under his administration was growing at a 4% on an annual basis. So we're going to be talking about Dilma Rousseff next. So her presidency was known for a lot of scandals and controversy. And with all this, scandals and controversy, there came a shrink in GDP. So under Dilma's administration, GDP shrank about 3.5% annually. Um, Her government also subsidized lending. This was to help promote public works. Um, she also ignored her advisors, which pleaded her to reform tax, labor, and pensions. Prior to her presidency, pensions were very generous in Brazil, and there was a high inflation rate in Brazil. Um, and ultimately, her administration was a failure, and she was impeached in 2016.
I'm going to be talking about who led Brazil to have the largest economy in Latin America at one point. Obviously, right now, Brazil is facing a lot of economic issues, which Mary is going to talk about later. But next one. Brazil had the largest economy when Lula was president. Now, Luis Inacio Lula da Silva became president in 2003. But before that, he was a union leader and he led many union strikes where he was able to kind of develop a following, and he was given a leader position. He was given a leader position, which came to form the Working Party, where all of the workers and low income people were supportive of him and what he believed was right and what he believed needed change. So the economy, next one, please. So when he was president, Lula actually made the economy grow tremendously. He had many social programs that caused both social and economic reform in Brazil. One of his programs was called the Zero Hunger program, where he worked to end hunger throughout Brazil. Lula's most popular social reform program was actually Bolsa Familia, where he gave low income, very poverty stricken families money so that way they could survive in Brazil. And this program actually led Brazil's economy to grow tremendously. It brought over 20 million Brazilians out of poverty. And this program actually gave incentives to Brazilian families with children would get more money to keep their children in school, to provide them with whatever is necessary for them to be able to continue going to school. Which is why, again, this program was so successful and it's actually still implemented today because of all of this money coming into the economy. Businesses were also happy because there was a grow in demand and there was a grow in money supply. So more people were able to buy, businesses were selling more, and overall the economy was starting to better itself, and it was actually at the best position that it had been throughout Brazil's history. However, um, However, Lula is very against privatization, and he actually prefers to grant money to subsidies and government owned businesses because he thinks that it's a better use of the money. Lula wants to keep the money within the Brazilian economy, and he avoids privatization because he is very against corruption and actually wants to end corruption between these businesses and other important figures. I know in the economy of Brazil there have been a lot of corruption scandals, and Lula himself was actually involved in one of these corruption scandals for which his charges were later annulled. Um, and now he will be the future president of Brazil. But yes, him and his opinions on privatization actually kind of limited his overall reach. But overall, his tactics in taking care of the Brazilian economy proved to be super beneficial, and we can only wait to see how he will repair Brazil's current economic crisis in the years to come.
I'm going to talk about the modern economy of Brazil, specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic and under Jair Bolsonaro's rule. So, the COVID-19 pandemic hit Brazil very hard, and they had a very high death rate, mortality rate, and also just infection rate. And because of that, their economy was also hit very hard. So, they had higher unemployment than they had in the past few years, as it had previously been dropping. And inflation had continued to rise, and more dramatically than it had been, although it had been consistently rising almost since the Bretton Woods era had ended. So, in terms of environmental development, Brazil has struggled to sort of transition their economy from their very mining and oil and gas and forestry based economy to a more sustainable economy. And Jair Bolsonaro is definitely not helpful in this. He definitely consistently implemented different laws and rules and regulations that continued the destruction of the Amazon and did not halt it by any means, specifically to try and help with the economy, but it wasn't really taking into consideration environmental development in the longer term years. And Brazil is currently not on track to meet the National Development Council targets for them in terms of this environmental development and sustainability. So they're going to have to find a way to sort of transition their economy. But on this note, during COVID, Brazil did see a small shift in their economy from mining and manufacturing to the service industry. And I'm not really sure the cause of this, but yeah, they're kind of diversifying their economy in this way. And service industry has become a bigger percentage of their overall GDP. And Brazil has a similar system to the US of free market capitalism that is also has regulations and taxes and government controls. And in terms of like quotas or whatever it is, that sort of restricts their economy from being completely free market. And they actually have a much higher tax rate than the US on average. So about 65% total taxes versus US 44% total tax rate, down to 36 during COVID, but right before COVID, actually. Yeah, it was interesting to see that Brazil has a much higher tax rate than the US does. The recent COVID response under Jair Bolsonaro's rule has been the implementation of fiscal policy, specifically in terms of social benefits and unemployment benefits and just money provided to the people of Brazil, which is interesting because Jair Bolsonaro is typically considered a very conservative president, although these fiscal policies he implemented during COVID were more socialist and progressive, as he was giving a lot of unemployment benefits and things that in the US we think of more socialist presidents supporting. And these policies were one of the reasons why the unemployment rate in Brazil has been rising, because it has sort of disincentivized workers from going back to work because they're actually earning just as much or more money from the government than they would be if they were working in these jobs. And it has been difficult for businesses to get their workers back because they're not able or willing to pay them higher wages than the government can give them.
So this is a visual representation of all of Brazil's exports. And from this image, you can tell that their economy is largely based around resource extraction and the agricultural industry. In the top right here, we can see Brazil's imports. although they export a lot of oil, they also import a lot of oil, and this is because they don't have enough refineries, so they export the crude petroleum and import it back as refined oil. And just like a lot of other developing nations, they import a lot of computer chips and electronic parts because they can't make them themselves. And they also import a lot of potassium chloride or potash, which is a chemical fertilizer for their agricultural industry. On the bottom, we can see that they mainly export to the United States and China, as well as a few other first world nations. And in the top left, once again, we can see their top exports, and their largest is soybeans with $28.5 billion this year. And their massive cattle feed and cattle industry has actually been very damaging to the environment, directly leading to the deforestation of the Amazon. People want to expand their farms, so they clear the forest, usually by burning, and this burning is releasing a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. And forests usually are carbon sinks, but the amount of emissions coming from the Amazon is more than most nations. If you look at this graph, you can see that deforestation sharply decreased under the Lula administration and increased during the Bolsonaro administration. Bolsonaro was vocally against deforestation, but deforestation did go up during his administration, and he cut funding for conservation programs and other scientific programs. And recently, in COP27, Lula promised to once again cut deforestation, but only time will tell if this actually happens. There are a lot of laws in Brazil that are designed to protect the forest, but they are rarely enforced, so the ranchers continue to expand their cattle grazing lands into protected areas in clear defiance of the federal government. To many people living in the Amazon, progress is clearing the forest to expand their cities and farms. So it's clear that the agricultural industry and deforestation in the Amazon is harmful to the entire planet. But for now, Brazil's economy will continue to benefit from the destruction of the Amazon.